Very good. Our next technical speaker today, you had the opportunity to meet this morning. He was awarded our Diamond Award, which is, again, you think of coal when they come in as a student and under tons and tons of pressure from their faculty, they turn into a diamond. So Jesser was chosen to be a speaker before we realized that he was going to end up being our award winner, but it worked out to be very nice. So not only did you get to hear that he's a great student, but now you get to hear some of his great research that he's done. So our next speaker will be Desiree? Oh, God, good, okay. Giranetto, yes.
Perfect. Okay. I think the goal for whoever gives a talk in the afternoon right after lunch is try to keep their audience awake. That's what I'll try to do. Just want the bar back there to get off. Okay. So first goal, try to keep you awake. Second goal, give you something that is a little bit different from what we are used to here. We're used to very low level, how we do code protection, how we do cybersecurity in our systems. What I'm giving you today is something a little bit high level, a little bit less detailed, because I'm dealing with complex systems, interaction between systems. So we heard in a talk this morning, I'm Boeing, I'm building an airplane. My problem is not my avionics security. My problem is when the airline chooses their entertainment system, and I could have some trouble here. So first of all, I will tell you what I'll talk to you about. This is just an application of some of my research for my PhD. I will tell you why we decided to introduce this application to cybersecurity. And I will give you the 4-slide summary of what in my dissertation is 100 pages. That's one of the methods I developed during my 4.5 years here at Purdue. This is called System Operational Dependency Analysis, SODA. And I will show you how we are using this methodology in different applications. And in particular, today I will show you how we can use it to address some of the problem of cybersecurity. And then I will give you just a quick glance of a second method that doesn't have a cool acronym. It's just System Developmental Dependency Analysis, SDDA. We should find some better acronym for this one. And then we'll draw the conclusions. Okay, let's start with complex systems. We have a bunch of systems that are connected together. There are systems that need for input by some other system. And we got our nice happy pirate who is trying to attack our system. Now, what we can do is basically two things. The first is reducing or containing the attacks. So trying to block people outside our systems or trying to destroy their tools with which they're attacking, so make them unhappy. This is done mostly at the level of individual systems. And this is what we are good enough, we're quite good at doing it right now. Now we got another problem. We have to reduce the impact of attacks that go through the so-called interstitials. We have to try to reduce the attacks that do not affect directly a system, but that can either be attacked to some connection between systems, or they can be attacked to an individual system that don't cause huge trouble in that system, but then they cause a cascading effect that may have higher impact than we imagine. So the first step we need to do for this second part, reduce the impact of attacks, is we need to analyze this impact and assess what is the risk of this kind of attacks. And for this classification, I use a talk by Powell, 2010. He classified 3 effects of cyber attacks. The primary effect is direct disruption of an individual system under attack. The secondary, which we call secondary or internal effect, is the disruption of services that were provided by the system under attack. And then there's a tertiary effect, that is the cascading impact on operability of other systems. So what it means is that in a complex system, and actually it happens every day, we can accept some attacks if they do not cause too much disruptions. And what I'm trying to do with this application is quantify what it means too much, and how can we actually compute and quantify what is this impact, tertiary impact. So our goal in supporting cybersecurity in complex systems and system of systems is addressing these tertiary effects. These tertiary effects come out of three, I don't think you can see it in the back, so I will read it out. Three features of complex systems: operational dependencies between the systems we're dealing with, complex overall behavior that is not easy to understand. Sometimes there's some propagation or some propagating effect that we didn't even consider. That is due to some emergent behavior in our complex systems. So we need to also analyze what are these cascading effects. We need to keep in mind that securing our individual components or individual systems does not guarantee that the overall system will be secure. And this is a step that working with the systems to me was quite obvious. When I talked to practitioners, they always had in mind, okay, if I secure all my individual systems, everything will work fine. Wrong. So let's switch to some little more technical talk about SOTA. This is the first of the 4 summary slides. SOTA is a parametric model of system behavior. It all starts back from simple linear economic models, trying to match input and outputs and see how our outputs behave when the inputs change. And then this simple linear model, of course, could not model accurately enough some complex operational dependencies. So other people, Hames, and then Garvin, Pinto, and Miter, developed some more complex model based on 2 parameters. And in particular, Garvin Pinto developed this functional dependency network analysis tool that measured and quantified the dependencies between capabilities that we wanted to achieve. Starting from this method, I ran a lot of experiments. Since, as you heard this morning, I have a lot of trouble getting data. My research is funded by the Department of Defense. They're giving me money, but not data. And I would like both of them. Of course, they cannot because of my citizenship. And the same is when we've been put in contact with MITRE, the Navy, the Army Research Lab, and NASA. And of course, they always have trouble with data. So what they ask me is either I teach them how to use my methods, and they use them, or I have to make up my data. So what I did is I ran a lot of simulations for various applications that we built. I built agent-based models. I ran some experiments to determine how good were these parametric models. And they were good, but not really awesome. They couldn't model some behavior that instead I would have really loved to. For example, when there's some dependency, you can imagine input-output is almost stepwise. So if we have some input, we get almost no output, and then all of a sudden we get quite a good output. These parametric models could not capture that behavior. This caused trouble because when we got results in our SOTA model, they were very different from what we saw in the agent-based model. So what I did was improving it, adding a third parameter, adding something that represents the internal status of the systems we are considering. And in the end, as we'll see in next slides, I achieved a quite good model that can give some information for high-level architectural decision. What we're trying to do with this tool is identifying how I can put my systems together in a feasible way that is also robust enough to allow me to achieve a certain threshold of operability even when I'm under attack. We can identify what are the criticalities, and besides that, we can identify what are the reasons of the behavior we observe. That is something that, for example, surface response methodology do not give us. They give very good models, but they do not tell us why the systems behave the way I observe. So by using this method, after we identify these criticalities, identify why something happens, we can discard flawed architectures and improve the architectures that are already working in a good way. I will save you the math that's behind it. The simple points that I want you to take out of how SOTA works is that we have a normalized concept of internal status. It's just a percentage, how well my system is working. Is it giving me 40% of its capabilities? Is it giving me 100%, 80%? Of course, this number will be related to some physical property. In some of my applications, for example, is probability of correct radar detection, or probability that the system gives enough bandwidth, and so on. Based on this internal status, we go and see what is the output. So based on the operability of the system I, we're going to see how the operability of system J behaves. And of course, system J has its internal status, but then part of its final output will depend on what system I is passing in. And long story short, we have this piecewise linear input-output behavior. That's the minimum of these two curves. So we identify that most systems can be modeled with an area that we call SOD zone. It stands for strength of dependency. That is an area where when the operability in input decreases, the operability in output decreases, but not so much. We can still be above some acceptable threshold. And then we got a critical area, when we start getting very low inputs, when we got very high disruption in system I or somewhere in the interstitial, then we have a huge loss. So we quantify this model with these three parameters. Usually we get them from simulation, where if we don't have even simulation, we can use expert opinion that I would just leave as the final resource. It would be better to have historical experimental data. So if I'll ever have citizenship at some point, maybe I will be able to get this data. Of course, this is just a single dependency, system I to system J. It can become more complex. This is just a dependency of my detection capability from helicopter radar, ship radar. The blue dots are the results of the experiments from the agent-based model simulation. That's quite detailed. This fit was the old two parameters FDNA model. And you can see it wasn't a good representation in some points. This fit on the right is a SODA model, 3 parameters. And I want to underline again that we accept to lose a little bit of detail with what happens in real life, but we have parameters that have some physical meaning. The parameters are telling me how critical is this dependency, how strong is this dependency, how wide is my critical zone. Final slide for SODA. Quick 3 steps of how we apply it. In our complex system, we identify what are the operational dependencies. This also means that those parameters and those numbers that we call operability and self-effectiveness or internal status will have a physical meaning. So we are exactly telling what is internal status of SLS, what is internal status of Orion capsule, and what these arrows mean. What do I need for this operational dependency between spacecraft? And what is the operational dependency of achieving my mission to Mars upon these systems? Then, if we have historical data, if we have experiments or whatever is the source, we identify the parameters that represent these dependencies. At this point, we can run our SODA analysis. It can be, and we'll see later in some application, can be deterministic. Single point, we decide what are the failures or what is the current operability status of each system, and we measure what will be the cascading effect on the operability of all the other systems until finding out the numbers we are interested in, for example, with how much percentage I achieve my capability of executing this mission to Mars. Or it can be some stochastic analysis, like this plot you can see here. I just assign probability distributions to the operability of each of these nodes, so their internal status. Somebody tells me this is a very robust system, this is non-robust, this is a system of which we don't know anything, use a uniform distribution. And what I measure is probability density function of operabilities of all the other systems. What will my final system 5 do? What will be the expected value out of it? What do we do to apply it to cybersecurity? First of all, system that is working correctly, and we imagine this simple 3-node network. Our arrows are just communication links. So the operability dependency is just communication bands. And in this case, I assume that it was, the operability was number of packets per second that arrived correctly at destination. Everything is working. Internal status of this system is 100%. Each one of the dependent systems will see 100% of the required input. We can have an attack to one system. That system will be disrupted. And we have what I call secondary effect, the internal effect. The service given by that system is now not anymore 100%, it's 70%. And of course, both the dependent system will see this 70% of the required input. Or something can happen at the interstitial. It can be a disruption, it can be an attack. And the result is that this system will still have its 100% operability, but then it won't be able to communicate the required input, for example, in this 1K band. So one system will see the 100% of the required input. The other will see only 50%. Now the question is this good enough? And if it's not, where do we want to act? Do we want to improve the robustness here? Do we want to improve the robustness of this individual system? Do we want to change our architecture completely? And these are some of the questions that I'm trying to answer. And are there any questions? Preliminary questions? Sure. Yes. I'm not generating data from that model. I'm using the model to analyze. I'm generating data from an agent-based model. So I'm generating the blue dots you've seen. It's independent. The piecewise linear model is what I use to model the results that I would see in real life or from simulation. And I use the simplified model to analyze and get results. Yes, correct. OK. I will show you this simple example. It's a very small network. I got something for NASA that has 300 nodes, and it's really hard to follow. So I will go with the simple 5 nodes analysis. One control center, 2 satellites, a UAV, a carrier that needs some information from one of the satellites, and UAV to perform its task. This is a small part of a naval warfare scenario, which we'll see a larger network later. I ran some reduced number of simulations here. Of course, we don't want to spend too much time in simulation, otherwise this model would be useless. So I did some design experiment, ran a few simulations, feed the data, and these are the 3 parameters for each of this dependency: strength, criticality, and impact, that tells us how wide the critical zone is. So for each of these dependencies, we can see what is the direct impact on the immediately following system. First kind of analysis I did is a simple deterministic analysis. Let's assume that each one of the systems can fail one at a time, and they go down to 25% of their internal status. So let's see what happens if the control center is now working at 25% of its operability. And in this case, it's still, the meaning of operability in this application was, again, information transmitted to the following systems. What happens if the operability of the satellite number 2 decreases to 25% and so on? And our measure of merit, our measure of performance in this case is how well is the carrier performing? And we could see that actually if the carrier itself was disrupted somehow, either by failure or by attack, in the end, it was supported so much, like its operability depended so much on previous system, that even if the internal system of the carrier lost 75%, in the end, the final operability of the carrier lost only 15%. So what we identified is actually, given this topology, our most critical systems were number 1 and number 4. So the control center and this one satellite. Of course, we can get the same in the case of cyber attacks if the attack is not directed to a system but to a communication channel. So in this case, I would assume less disruption and more active attack. The deterministic analysis is the same as for attack to the nodes. We got a disrupted link. That means the system is working correctly, but then its output goes along the link number 2 and link number 3, but along link number 1, only 25% of the required output is received by this satellite. And again, we can identify what are the most critical links. In this case, the last two, so the links that bring the final communication to the carrier. And they're critical, even if you think that here they're failing one at a time. So it means that we still achieve communication on one of the two channels, but still we lose almost 30% of the final operability. A little bit better, we can have a more thorough understanding of what actually happens in this topology if instead of focusing on a single case, we have some distribution. For example, in this case, we have internal status of regular systems has a beta distribution shifted to the right. So there are systems that usually work around 80–90% of their maximum capability. And my disrupted system in this case, instead of going down to a single number, 25%, follows a beta distribution. This is a beta 211, for who is familiar with beta distributions. So it's just the probability that the internal status of my disrupted system will have this value. I ran the same analysis as before, except that in this case we're running 100,000 cases every time. We simulate the probability distribution, and the outcome is a probability distribution for the operability of interest. So in this case, where the first node, the control center, following this distribution for internal status, and every other system in the network working correctly, this was the final distribution for the operability of the carrier. And you can see actually all the case of the final operability is always lower. We always have more loss than we had in the previous case. Because in the previous case, when we go down to 25%, we almost never reach the critical zone. We almost never reach the area when actually our loss in operability is a lot higher. Here instead, we have many cases, almost 50% of the cases, I think the median is here, that are between 0 and 20% of the internal status for each of these systems when there is disruption. So we can see that now node 1 is always critical as it was before, but now even node 3, that's the other satellite, and even the carrier itself are critical systems in this network. We can do the same with the links. Stochastic analysis, and again here, the links, the final links to the carrier were the most critical. And again, we see that all links are now more critical than they appear to be by doing a single point analysis. Now, what do we do with this data? I will show you with this slightly larger scenario, and you can see again that we are working at a very high level. This analysis can also be done at a lower level. I also did at the level of individual subsystems in one of these complex systems. Just the network becomes larger. Since the model is piecewise linear, it's actually very fast. So I had networks with 1 million nodes and 250,000 links, and I got the results in 25 seconds. So it's quite fast. So this was an application for Department of Defense, naval warfare scenario system of systems. We had our systems, helicopter, MH-60 helicopters, boats, UAVs, and surface vehicles, divided in groups that had different tasks. And the tasks were performing recon of mines, submarines, and enemy boats, and then engaging the enemy. Some of the systems had actually 2 tasks. They spent 90% of the time doing recon and 10% also engaging the enemy. First step, after defining what these links meant, and again, they were just for the radar's probability of detecting the enemy when it's within the range, and for the weapon system, probability of engaging the enemy when it's within the range, I converted to this SODA network topology. So now I'm interested in systems and subsystems when one of the ship had double task, so part recon, part attack. And then I added these nodes that just represent our capabilities that we're interested to quantify. That is, recon the enemy boats, the enemy mines, the enemy submarine, and engage the enemy mines, boats, and submarines. And I also had another topology that actually, another network that was embedded in this one, but I just split into, for clarity. These are the communication links. So when I do recon, I have to communicate to some other system. This is where the enemy is. Go engage the enemy. I ran various scenarios. This is one of the applications where I just picked 3 links. And again, I perform simple deterministic analysis, single point. There is some attack on these specific channels or these specific communication links, number 1, 2, and 3. And again, I look at the secondary effect, so how much the directly affected system lost in capability, but would watch the variation in the capability of engaging the enemy. So if I have a failure in link number 1, the ship of my surface warfare group lost 35% of its capability. But since it was embedded in this group, in the end, I lost only 8.75% capability of engaging the enemies on the surface. So this can still be acceptable. My admiral, general, whoever will tell me if it's acceptable. And of course, as we did the conversion from performance to this normalized measure of operability, we can also do the inverse operation. And I can tell that in this case, 8.75% means this much delay in terms of time in engaging the enemy. Something that might not be acceptable is, for example, if we lose link number 3, we have only one system, an helicopter that can engage the enemy submarine. If we lose this communication, we lose 45% of our capability here. That also will translate into 45% loss in our capability to engage the submarine. And of course, in this simple case, it's obvious the reason why, because we have this one system performing this task. In more complex system, actually, I have to go and look at cascading effect and find, with the parameters, I can find a path that tells me this is the path of high criticality, high strength, and this is the reason why this system is critical. Now that we know why, we can decide what to do. In this case, it's simple, improve the anti-submarine subsystem. Since the problem was the fact that we had only one system performing the task, but we also know that here we have a ship that can do reconnaissance of the submarines. Let's just this ship help. So we have a different topology where this ship can also recon submarines and communicate. And what happens is just we still have a loss here of 45%, but with this help, our final capability of the entire submarine reconnaissance group increases, and we lose only 25%. Of course, again, this is a simple example. I got more complex applications in the papers, in the backup slides. So this is all I have for SODA today. Second step, really quick, last 3 slides, what I did with SDDA. So at some point, somebody asked us, why don't you use this concept of operational dependencies even in a developmental domain? So based on the same ideas, in this case, my parameters do not represent operability dependencies, but operational dependencies, but they represent developmental dependencies. How much the development of various systems can be overlapped, how much they are independent from each other, and what is the cascading effect of some delay in developing these systems. Of course, in simple PERT networks, we just have this, I guess most of you are familiar with PERT techniques. We have these absolute dependencies. I need to wait until a system is fully developed and deployed to start the development of my other systems. When we have multiple stakeholders and we are talking about complex systems, this is not the case. We might have some partial overlapping, and we have to decide how much we want to begin the development of a system before some other system is fully developed. There's some risk associated because I can start my development, my other stakeholder tells me these are the data you can base upon, but at some point they will say, oh, you know what, I'm not giving you the system anymore, or I will have 2 years delay. How does this impact what we're doing? And how do we use this together with SODA to decide topologies that are more robust towards attacks? I will skip the model and just say how much we can start ahead of time our development. What's important is some application. For example, in this case, I had 3 different developmental architectures called A, B, and C that were still for the naval warfare scenario system. I just decided to develop my anti-submarine, anti-surface, anti-mine systems at different times. So the first thing I have is my capability, my operability of detecting and engaging the enemy is growing over time because I'm deploying more and more systems. But at some point, I might have some disruption or some attack, or just some stakeholder deciding that they won't give me their system anymore. First thing we can measure is how much our architecture is robust. Can it recover? Architecture C is the more robust. Simply, the risk we had accepted was less. We had deployed some system later, so we achieved less capability at some point, less than the architecture B or A. But since we had this later deployment, we also had more flexibility. That means when there was this attack or disruption, architecture C was the best, was the more robust. Or we can have resilience, capability to recover part of this operability. Think of the example I gave before when one system could replace another. So in this case, what we saw is that instead architectures B and C were better at recovering. We already had some system deployed, but they had some rule by which they could replace each other, and they still could perform well. So what we're doing here is trying to use together the operational domain, the developmental domain, and again, the goal is identify what architectures are better in terms of robustness and resilience against the tertiary effect. And I want to underline again, this does not replace any concept of security within a single system. As you can see, it's something that we need to add to security in individual systems. Conclusion, I show you this SODA tool. It's a dependency analysis tool. It's a parametric model of behavior. We're using in cybersecurity application to represent the tertiary effect, that is the cascading effect of disruption and attacks on systems. I show you how we can identify critical system, critical links. Stochastic analysis takes longer, but of course gives more information. And we can, at this point, do some educated analysis and educated change in the topology of our networks. The software, the current version of the software, of course, is still an academic version, is not fully complete, but it's available for free on nanohub.org. It is Purdue-owned. Purdue students and members, faculty and staff can just access with their credentials. Everybody can create a free account on NanoHub and use these tools. There's also manuals and everything in there. Are there any questions, or is there time for questions?
We're out of time. Thank you very much, Desiree.
Thank you.